Yesterday, I read a tweet from Chris Kloos, which highlighted one of the most horrific passages from William Lane Craig, talking about the Canaanite genocide and the rationale for killing infants and small children. And I mean, obviously, I've addressed this topic ad nauseum over the years, but it's always worth coming back because every time I put out a new video on this, maybe a few more people will see that video, or if I read an article, they'll read that article, and maybe then they'll be persuaded this is evil, this is heinous, and they will change their minds about the way they think about biblical violence. And in that way, gradually, we begin to shift the way that Christians think about these heinous actions, these heinous texts. And so here's Craig. Here's a couple excerpts I'm going to take from this passage. In the first, I'll link the article below from his Reasonable Faith website. It's from last November of 2024. And in the first section, we're going to look at he's quoting himself from an earlier article. Okay, so he talks about how in this passage, God is setting strong dichotomies, as he says, harsh dichotomies between in group and out group in order that the Israelites would maintain their purity. You can think he's in particular, I should say, referencing Deuteronomy chapter 7, verses 2 to 5, where God is talking about the need for the Israelites to be distinct from the people in the land and not intermarry with them and destroy all of their culture and etc. He says it was his way of preserving Israel's spiritual health and posterity. God knew that and then he goes on to the children. God knew that if these Canaanite children were allowed to live, they would spell the undoing of Israel. The killing of the Canaanite children not only served to prevent assimilation to Canaanite identity, but also served as a shattering, tangible illustration of Israel's being set exclusively apart for God. Nothing could so illustrate to the Israelis. It's interesting that he uses the contemporary term Israeli rather than the proper biblical term Israelite. There's nothing could so illustrate to the Israelis the seriousness of their calling as a people set apart for God alone. Yahweh is not to be trifled with. He means business. And if Israel apostatizes, the same could happen to her. As C.S. Lewis put it, Aslan is not a tame lion. I can only imagine what C.S. Lewis would think about having his words from The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe appropriated to justify child massacre as an object lesson of the holiness of God. But that's what we have here. So, on Craig's understanding of who God is, God needed to communicate to the Israelites, not the Israelis, he needed to communicate to the Israelites how important it was to be holy, and that if they allowed Canaanite children to live, that would hamper their holiness. So they had to slaughter the children, had to butcher those children, had to massacre those children in order to ensure that they would be holy. Think about that. What are you talking about? Slaughtering children, slaughtering infants, butchering toddlers to ensure that you remain holy. That's like binging on cheesecake to ensure that you lose weight. It does not compute. I shouldn't be laughing. It's so grotesque. It should make us outraged. Not least because your toleration for these kinds of heinous actions, in fact, your belief that heinous actions in ancient Israel could be the way of securing your holiness, will only predispose you to act in similar ways today. Think about Gaza. So then the Canaanite infants, toddlers, and children serve as object lessons of God's holiness and deterrence for the Israelites acting in an unholy manner, according to Craig. Think about that. The only way on Craig's account for an omnipotent, all-powerful God, the only way that that all-powerful God could ensure the holiness of his people was by slaughtering children as an object lesson that to those people, that if you deviate from the path I have set aside for you, you will be slaughtered like those children. That is Craig's understanding of who God is. And then the next slide, or that we're going to look at, Craig now comments on this quotation that he has quoted of himself from an earlier article. This is what he says. He says, the very gruesomeness of the slaughter of the Canaanites was the most powerful object lesson imaginable to the Israelis. Again, his use of Israeli. Of the need for and importance of separation from pagan nations and religions. Having the Canaanite children simply ascend to heaven would certainly not have furthered that goal. God had more in view than simply taking these children to heaven. First of all, there's nothing at all in the text about Canaanite children going to heaven. That is Craig's projection. It's his attempt to ameliorate the cognitive dissonance that is created by his glaring and enthused endorsement of moral horrors, of genocidal slaughter, of war crimes and crimes against humanity. He's trying to put uh, a silver lining on the darkest of unimaginably darkest of clouds by saying, well, they went to heaven. The text gives no hint that these children went anywhere, let alone to a blessed afterlife with Yahweh. I mean, it's absurd. But the point here, the main point is that he's saying, yeah, God could have just removed the children. There's a nice euphemism, remove them, like through a relatively painless, quick death and taken them to heaven. But that would not have been appropriately horrifying. So the deaths of the children needed to be horrifying to impact the Israelites so that they would maintain their holiness, according to Craig. Do you see what he's just done here? He's just said, don't kill the children quickly and painlessly. The children need to die in a very painful way because that will increase the horror of the Israelites and draw them more closely to the path of holiness of Yahweh, according to Craig. Now, this leads us into one of the themes that I talk about, one of the topics I address, I should say, in Jesus Loves Canaanites. And that is how closely genocidal slaughter is linked to torture and, by the way, to rape. If you go through history, time and again, when genocides happen, what comes with them is the torture and mutilation of the victims of genocide. And there's a reason for that. It's because when you begin to dehumanize and objectify human beings, then increasing the cruelty toward those human beings is a way in the short term of addressing the cognitive dissonance of killing them. Because by further dehumanizing them, you are temporarily reducing the cognitive dissonance of your actions. So, what you see as I give the extended example of Rwanda, in fact, we can switch to this image of some of the bones from and skulls from some people that were massacred in a church during the Rwandan genocide in 1994. Just look at the numbers here. This is what Craig is rationalizing. But imagine all these skulls are children. And on this account that Craig has given us, it's not enough just to kill them. You have to inflict pain and suffering on them in order to maximize the sense of God's holiness upon you as the Israelite people. And so in Rwanda in 1994, there were numerous accounts, not just of Tutsis being killed by the Hutus, but being tortured, mutilated, in order to extend their pain and suffering. That became a intrinsic part of the genocide itself. And that's what he opens the door to here, where he talks about having them simply ascend to heaven would not have furthered the goal of the importance of being separate from them. The deaths had to be gruesome. A death that is gruesome opens the door for, well, then the infants had to be tortured. The children had to be mutilated. It's only when you further desecrate their bodies, when you inflict as much suffering upon them as you can in the process of killing them, that you will have the most powerful object lesson imaginable, in Craig's words, to sustain your commitment to the holiness of following Yahweh. That's what Craig's defending here. Yeah, he's defending genocide. He's defending crimes against humanity, child slaughter, go on, ethnic cleansing. But he's defending, by implication, extending into maximal gruesomeness the killing of these children, which entails actions like torture and mutilation. That is how grotesque. That is the legacy of William Lane Craig. He's done so much in apologetics. Yet, if you want to talk about, oh, you've done a lot for the philosophy of the Trinity and the cosmological argument, but if your legacy includes defending moral vomit like this, that negates your legacy. Now, I'm going to use what is almost a criminal understatement to conclude, and that's this. Sane washing is the act of minimizing the perceived radical aspects of a person or idea in order to make them appear more acceptable to a wider audience. Craig is engaging in the most unbelievable kind of sane washing here. I just want to conclude with the penultimate sentence and just come back to that. He says, having the Canaanite children simply ascend to heaven would certainly not have furthered that goal. Look at the use in terms of punctuation of that exclamation point. It suggests almost a levity in the way he communicates, rather than a sobriety for the horrifying shock of what he has just claimed. He adds an exclamation point. It is it is just the arsenic icing on a morally poisonous cake. I don't know, I just pulled that out of the air. I don't know how to put words to this, except it's just that further little bit of moral grotesqueness in what he has argued. The children need to be killed as an object lesson for the holiness of God. The killing needs to be maximally gruesome, which, read between the lines, would entail such actions as torturing and mutilating the children as they're dying and when they're dead. And then underscoring that to conclude, just allowing them to die quickly would certainly not have furthered the goal of holiness. That is the sane washing. That is the legacy of William Lane Craig.